Good morning. Good morning, friends. Good morning, church. How are you doing this morning? I'm Brian. I'm the pastor here at Christ United Methodist Church. And I just wanted to say hello and good morning and welcome to another edition of PB Reads the Bible. Today is episode 1 on the book of Romans. Book of Romans. This is actually a picture of a cover of one of my resources, one of my commentary books specifically on Romans. It's a series of books called Interpretation, a Bible commentary for teaching and preaching, and this one is specifically on the book of Romans. So this is like, I don't know if you'd say full disclosure time or what. Much of what you're going to hear me say over the coming weeks as we go through Romans is going to come from books like this. Okay. Don't want you to think that I'm so smart I come up with all this stuff on my own, because it's definitely not the case. Definitely not the case, especially not with Romans. Got to use multiple resources to come up with stuff. So one of them is going to be this book called Interpretation. The other one that I will be relying on quite heavily is the New Interpreter's Bible, and in particular the section on Romans from there. So because there's a lot of stuff. Anyway, good morning and welcome to this. This is our episode 1 on our journey through Romans. It's going to take us some time to get through Romans. I forgot to look. I think there's like 16 chapters in Romans, and so it's not super long, but it's long for what it is, and it's very, very, very dense. So we're going to be taking time going through it. But go ahead and check in. I see we've got some viewers this morning, which is cool. And Cindy and John. Good morning, John. John is already checking in. Good morning, John. Good to see you. Others, feel free to do that same thing. Say something in the comments section of the stream, so that to me, to each other, that kind of thing. You got a question or a comment, you can post that there as well. You can also send me a text if you, excuse me, if you wanted to make things a little bit more private, especially if there's something you want me to pray about. I want to hear about those things too. You can put them in the stream, or you can send me a text. That's 570-351-1619. Okay. Good morning, Marcia. So sometimes I feel like an electronics geek. Please don't think that I actually know what I'm doing, all right? Because that's not, but I've got a computer screen off to the left, a monitor on the left, watching the stream on Facebook so I can see your comments and stuff. Of course, I've got the one in front of me, which is doing the streaming and recording, and then on my other side I've got my phone. So if you see me looking from one side to the other, I'm not going crazy or having some sort of a facial tick. I'm looking to see what's going on with you folks, and don't want to miss anything. Now I know some of our friends, some of our regulars aren't able to be with us live this morning because they have other obligations, and you know who you are. But I am blown away that I'm blown away that you take time to watch me live. I'm blown away that you take time out of your lives to watch me in a recording later on. So thank you for all that. Thank you for all that. Good morning from the parking lot, waiting for a friend and an appointment. Oh, good morning, Cindy. Good morning, Cindy. Good morning. Cool. Wow. Humbled. Okay. You're not here to talk about that. This week should be a regular week, or at least for you, it should be. Definitely Thursday and Friday are definitely going to be recordings from my end. They'll be live for you. Okay, they'll be live for you. But Thursday morning, I have a 3-hour Zoom meeting starting at 9. I forget if it's 9 or 9:30. That one's starting, so I will be unable to do it live on Thursday, and of course Friday is my Sabbath. So Thursday and Friday will be live for you at 9 o'clock, although they will have been pre-recorded by me. Excuse me, probably the day before. Same thing might take place with Wednesday. Not 100% sure about that. I've been invited to participate in something on Wednesday and just have to look at the weather and my schedule and see if I have time to do that. Anyway, so again, you're not here for all that. Just wanted you to know that things are regular for you. Good morning, Marilyn. Here with you for the beginning. Cool. And that's what today is going to be. Today is going to be a beginning on the book of Romans. In fact, I doubt that I'm actually going to even crack the Bible open this morning and start reading. We might, but I doubt it, because I think there's a lot that I need to say about the book before we actually read the book. I hope that makes sense. I think it does. I think it makes sense. Romans is, well, in our Bibles, in Protestant Bibles in particular, Romans is the first of what would be considered the epistolaries, the epistles, the writings, the letters. The New Testament, of course, starts off with the four Gospels, the four biographies of Jesus that are part of canon. Anyway, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and which we've done 2 of those, and many of you followed along for both of those as well. And then it got into the historical book, the only historical book of the New Testament, which is Acts. Good morning to you, Colleen. Good morning to you, Colleen. Acts is the historical book. I say it's usually referred to as Acts of the Apostles. I like to say that it's Acts of the Holy Spirit because it deals with so much that the Holy Spirit does. But it's also the history of the early church, the first couple decades of the early church. Of course, it wasn't written down as things were happening. Much of it was written down afterwards, right? And it is presumed to have been written by Luke. Anyway, slight digression. But then we get into what are the epistles, the letters from various authors, some of which we know, some of which tradition says they were, but probably weren't, and some that we really don't know who they were. Some epistles were written to individuals, while some were written to churches. To a group, to a house church, in most cases a house church. And some were written to multiple churches or multiple house churches. Most of them are identified by name. Most of the epistles, as far as who they were directed to. There are a couple exceptions to that rule. When you get into the epistles from Peter, John, and James, those were written, well, tradition says were written by those individuals rather than to those individuals, right? Which we just yesterday started our series, our worship series on the book of First John. That was the first letter of St. John. So that's an epistle. That's an epistle. The majority of the epistles traditionally were identified as having been written by Paul. Biblical study, biblical scholarship, literary scholarship now says that they weren't all written by Paul. Some certainly were, while others were most likely written by other individuals much later than Paul's life, as much as 100 years after Paul had died, after Paul had been executed, I suppose I should say. So were probably written by just his proteges, so to speak. And of course, how do we know that? How do we know that they weren't written by Paul? A couple things, every author has, regardless of whether you're talking scripture or fiction books or historical novels, every author has a style that is, his or her own. And Paul had a particular style. He had a way of writing, a way of speaking we might say, and his voice is very obvious in some of the books, but in some of those books that are questionable, his voice isn't there. Someone else's voice is in it. There are differences in sentence structure, differences in choice of words, and things like that. The other way we know that some of those books that were traditionally said to have been written by Paul probably weren't written by Paul is because of theme, because of what the author is talking about. Paul had very specific themes that he was discussing, mostly, theological, and he was addressing current events. He was addressing problems that were taking place in churches right then, things that churches were concerned about. And some of these letters are talking about things that weren't a concern in the mid first century. They became concerns in the early to mid second century. So probably were written, that would indicate that they were written by somebody else at a later time. Anyway, why does a person write a letter? Why were the epistles written? What would be the purpose of a particular letter? And the authors wrote them for a couple different reasons. One is a didactic reason, which means teaching. They were filled with teachings. They were there. They wrote them down to teach, to pass along information, and they were exhortations, which also deals with teachings. It's not perhaps exhortation as we might think, as far as condemnation and stuff like that, but it's exhortation also can actually involve encouragement. To exhort someone is in some ways to encourage, to keep the faith. Okay, so those are a couple of the different reasons for writing a letter. And of course, you would write a letter because you wanted someone to do something in a particular way. So when we read Philemon, we could understand that Paul was trying to get Philemon to do something, and so he wrote him a letter. Excuse me, in order to do that. So most of the ones that were for individuals fall into those categories, as far as to teach and exhortation, to encourage, to help along. So Paul to Timothy, assuming Paul wrote Timothy's, they're involving that and encouraging Timothy to continue and to do things, and trying to teach him at the same time how to do it. Many times when a letter was written to a church, for instance, First Corinthians, it is to address a particular issue or issues that were taking place, to exhort them, and to teach them, because it's a problem in the church that the author felt was necessary to get through to. Romans, again, in the New Testament of Protestant Bibles in particular, is the first of these epistles. And it doesn't fully fall into any of those categories. It seems to cross over into a couple different purposes, a couple different reasons for a letter. Perhaps the closest one would be the didactic reasons, because it is about teaching. It's about explaining something, but it's also a very challenging work at the same time. So there's some exhortation going on. It is, without a doubt, Paul's deepest letter. The British theologian N.T. Wright describes it as a mountain that needs to be climbed and ascended, and different people take different routes to get to the top, and it can be very difficult to ascend, and there's really no right route to get to the top, and you can see different things taking place. It's Paul's masterpiece. It truly is Paul's masterpiece as far as letters. First Corinthians is a wonderful passage, a wonderful book. but Romans is widely considered his masterpiece. So let's look at a couple things. Let's answer a couple questions about it, because the best thing to do when you're looking at any book of the Bible is to answer a few questions. The who, what, when, where, why, how kind of thing, right? Being good reporters. Well, we know the who. This one we are very confident was written by Paul, by Paul the Apostle, Saint Paul, Saul/Paul. Okay, we're very confident that he wrote this one. The where, the why, the when, and all that kind of stuff. The when, Bible scholars are fairly confident. They're in good agreement. there's no dating on the document. Paul didn't sign it with July 1st, 0032 or anything like that, right? They didn't do that kind of stuff. The best guesstimates that we can put at it, though, would place it at the late 50s of the first century. So 57 seems to be the year that most scholars agree on, plus or minus 2 years. So maybe as early as 55, maybe as late as 58, 59. But most scholars say 57 is when Paul wrote this. And it was when Paul was preparing. Paul was most likely, we believe that most likely Paul was in Corinth or near Corinth, in one of the surrounding towns, as he wrote this letter. He was not writing it to the people in Corinth. He was writing it to the churches in Rome. But he was staying in Corinth. He was preparing for his second journey back to Jerusalem. He was preparing to go back to Jerusalem so that he could then begin his journey to Rome en route to Spain. Okay, that was Paul's intention. And he makes that pretty clear in his writings. He was going back to Jerusalem so that he could travel to Rome, so that he could travel to Spain. That was where he wanted to go. Spain would have been considered like the end of the world, virtually. It's the far point, and he wanted to get to that far point, to preach, to teach, to start new churches. Of course, we know, looking back, he never actually got there. At least there's no documentation that would indicate that he ever got there. He got back to Jerusalem, and then things went bad. And he never met his goal of going to Rome on a missionary journey. Didn't happen. He went to Rome in a different way, but he didn't go to Rome in how he had intended. Plans had to change. So that's when he wrote it. That's where he was when he wrote it. What, when, where, why? Why? I guess we get to the big one now. Why? The why. Why did Paul write this letter? Okay. Paul is pretty clear about his theme in Romans. He's pretty clear about his theme in Romans. In the first chapter, and just the opening lines, the first 17 verses, Paul comes out and he uses the word righteousness, and he speaks about God's righteousness. And so he's setting out that's basically going to be what his theme is, and what he's going to be talking about throughout the book. However, he's got multiple sub-themes. The book overall can be divided up into 4 different sections, covering 4 different main themes: 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 through 11, and 12 to 16, I believe, are the breaks. However, when we say that, and when we put headings on sections, we need to be very careful with that. Not only as I'm talking and as reading my commentaries, but as you're reading your Bibles and you see those little headings, those little subscripts and telling you what this next passage is about. Don't read that section completely apart from what just happened. Okay. So sometimes people will do that. Sometimes scholars will do that. They'll say that 1 through 4 is one section. There's a little bit of an overlap in chapter 5, but chapter 5 really just wraps up the first section of the book, and then Paul moves on. It's not exactly true. It's not exactly true. There's more than just a little overlap. The main themes are throughout the whole book. And Paul starts things, he says things, he gives a partial answer to things early in the book or midway through the book. And then he comes back to that same thought much later in the letter to more fully answer the question that he brought up earlier. So as we go along, we're going to need to be careful. We are going to look at a particular section. And yes, we're going to talk about that section, but we need to make sure that we're remembering what Paul said before and don't completely separate what we're reading now from what Paul wrote earlier and from what Paul is going to write a little bit later on. I hope that's clear. I hope it's probably clear as mud because it can be that way. All right. But again, Paul starts right off and talks about God's righteousness. That's one of the first things that Paul mentions in it. Therefore, that's something we need to understand what Paul was talking about. Oh, because this actually ties into that whole when. I should have mentioned that with the when. Because Paul was writing this in 1st century, correct? And he's writing it to the church in Rome. Those are things that are important for us to know. So I got a text. Let me see if that's. Oh, well, welcome, Ron. Doesn't matter if you're a little late. You're here anyway. So Ron is also joining us live. You're going to have to go back later and watch the beginning that you missed because there's important stuff in there for the final exam. Spoiler alert, there's no final exam. Anyway, the idea of when, the 1st century, Paul is writing it to the Romans. Paul, of course, is Jewish, and he's writing it to Christians living in Rome. Mostly, almost exclusively, he's probably writing it to Gentile Christians living in Rome. And that's important. That's important. All of this is important. Okay, so that's where we know where he was writing from, and we know who he is writing to. We also have to remember his culture, how he grew up, where he is at, and who the people are that he's writing to, because those are important for us to understand what he's saying. And all of those things have an impact on our understanding, Paul's understanding of the word righteousness and righteous and righteousness. All right. Again, Dr. Wright just talks about this, that especially in Jewish culture at the time, well, the idea of righteousness, yes, is covenantal in nature, but it's also law court. It's also legal understanding. It's a legal term. Paul is using a legal term. And in Judaic court system, all cases were considered civil. There's no separation of civil and criminal cases. All cases would be considered civil. They are always a person against a person with a person. Okay, Jesus's arrest and trial is different. Don't talk about that one. But they're like always civil trials. They're always civil trials between people. You have a defendant and you have a plaintiff. Whichever party wins the case would be considered righteous. That word would be given to them. Righteous. Would be considered righteous. So if you're the defendant, and you are, we would use the word acquitted, but acquitted isn't strong enough. It doesn't have the full context of what this word means. you would be considered righteous. You would be declared righteous for everything that you had done throughout the trial and before. If you were the plaintiff and you successfully proved your case, then you would be declared the righteous one. And all of your actions through the trial and before the trial, preceding the trial, would be considered righteous. So Dr. Wright uses the term vindicated. Might be a better understanding when we're thinking about this from that legal standpoint of the idea of righteous. Vindicated. I am vindicated. I have been vindicated. I have been declared righteous by the judge, and the judge, Paul, would also be considered righteous, vindicated, and the idea of a judge having righteousness would be the idea of a judge having justice, providing justice. Justice would be on their side. So all that's important, okay? So when Paul talks about righteousness, we might have the idea of righteousness as some sort of a holy quality, right? We might be thinking of it theologically from that standpoint or something, and thinking of it as holy and a perfection and that kind of thing. Whereas Paul is most likely, anyway, using this legal idea of righteous as vindicated. And that word that we translate righteous can also be translated as justice. Okay, can also be translated as justice. That's equally important. Why? Because Paul is writing to Rome. He's writing to the Romans. Rome considered itself to be the seat of justice for everywhere. That justice started from Rome and went out from there. That Rome was in charge of declaring what was or was not right, and Rome was in charge of justice. So much so, and this would have been post Julius Caesar, beginning with Claudius Caesar, the goddess Eustacia, it's the goddess of justice, became a big god, a big goddess in Rome, in Roman culture. So much so that they had a big cult worship of Eustacia, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm probably wrong. Of the goddess of justice, and she became so associated and so connected with the empire and with Caesar, Claudius Caesar, that her name changed and she became known as Claudia. Okay, so Claudia became this goddess of justice. Eustacia, they changed her name, good, because Claudia is easier to pronounce, as the goddess of justice. So Paul, we'll see when we get in here, because Paul talks about God's righteousness, God's justice. Paul is throwing a challenge. He's throwing down the gauntlet. He is really challenging Rome, where they say that they're the seat of justice. Paul said, God's righteousness, God's justice. The judge that I'm going to be talking about, Paul is saying, isn't a human. It is God. It is God. He is the creator, the Lord of all creation. It would be the term that Paul would use. Don't remember if he actually uses that, but Lord of all creation, we've heard that term before, right? So he is talking, and he does call God Lord in this, which is also important. He's talking about God as the creator, and God being judge and pronouncing justice, righteousness on creation and on the creatures, humans. All right, all this is important stuff. It's complicated, but it's important. So when Paul is talking about that, he's throwing in an additional challenge at Rome. He's really going flying in the face of Rome with that, because according to Roman law, the only Lord that you were supposed to obey was Caesar. Caesar was Lord, but Paul is saying, nope. God isn't just Lord of a particular area. God is Lord of all creation. So there's a couple challenges in that basic idea right up front. Okay, so why is all that important, especially this idea of righteousness? Paul, being a Jew and writing to Gentile Christians, where does this idea of righteousness come from? Were Jews concerned about it? Were the Jewish people concerned about righteousness? Yes, as far as justice and this idea that Paul's going to have with judging creation and judging the earth and judging humanity and what kind of plan God has. Paul seems to be mixing a couple different things. There are a couple different ways in the first century that people looked at the world and looked at good and evil. Many people in that first century, the Greco-Roman culture, had a version of a Platonic thought that there were two realms. There were two realms. One is physical and one is spiritual. Okay. In the physical realm, matter, the things we see, is bad. It's evil. In the spiritual realm that you can't see, is good and pure and perfect. And that would be the locus, the place of existence of God, that God exists solely in the spiritual realm, because God is good all the time, and all the time God is good. So therefore, God exists in a spiritual realm, and a spiritual realm only, because this perfect goodness cannot exist in a material world that is evil and bad. The only overlap between the physical and the spiritual are human beings. That human beings have elements of both realms. And therefore human beings, because human beings are physical and have a spiritual essence. Therefore, human beings are capable of both evil and good in this thought. However, the thought carries forward to say that the goal of a human being, the goal of the soul or the spirit of a human being, would be to separate from the material and rejoin the spiritual realm. That the goal is kind of like saying, and this becomes Gnostic thought, Gnostic. Excuse me. Your spelling isn't important in the final exam. Spoiler alert, there's no final exam. But in that thought was that the spirit is trapped in the body, and the spirit longs to be released from the body so that it can rejoin the spiritual realm, the realm of goodness and perfection and all that kind of stuff. So that's the Greco-Roman thought, involving two realms. Jewish thought can be described with the word apocalyptic. Now, take the ideas out of your head that would normally put in there. Okay, we're not excuse me, we're not talking Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck drilling into an asteroid that's coming towards Earth, right? A comet that's coming towards Earth to blow it up so that it doesn't destroy the Earth. Okay, but the idea of that word apocalypse or apocalyptic gives us those kind of images. It's part of our culture. It's how the word has. It's what the word has come to mean, based on some of the apocalyptic writings of the first century and our misunderstanding of them, making us think that apocalypse and apocalyptic just means destruction and all that kind of stuff. And that's not what it is. Apocalyptic And apocalypse actually means reveal, revealing. So it's trying to explain something in a very visual way that you can't explain anyway else. Anyway, Jewish apocalyptic literature and this idea of Jewish apocalypse um, has to do with Jewish understanding of the nature of good and evil, but rather than two realms of Platonism, Jewish thought is two ages or two aeons. That would be the Greek word aeons, but two ages, two different time periods. And in the former age, or they would probably still say the current age, uh, would be where we are now, or where they were then. That Adam's fall brought along sin. You've got the law, but the law intensified sin. Paul's going to talk about that, and that's the age we're in. And evil reigns, and wickedness prevails, and all that. But it's not going to be like that forever. Jewish apocalypse, their understanding with the second aeon, the second age, that at some point in time, God will intervene and will change all of that. Will change all of that, and the second age, or the future age, will then take place, so that wickedness and evil and all that will be taken care of and go away, and everything will be, God will reign, and God will reign in this future. So that's the Jewish understanding. We could say that the Jewish understanding of righteousness and salvation, and their understanding of good and evil, is chronological. That things, time goes along, God intervenes, but time goes on in a different way. So we've got these two ages of how things go. Whereas the Greco-Roman understanding of salvation and good and evil is ontological, the essence of being, uh, rather than chronological. We're 9:37. We're definitely not going to be cracking the Bible open, because I'm almost done here, and I think that's more than enough for us to talk about today, right? Um, Paul seems to be using an adapted version of the Jewish understanding. Paul seems to be using an adapted version of the Jewish understanding, dare I say, a Christianized version of the Jewish understanding, saying that there was the former age where evil prevailed, sin was around, law was there, and that only made sin worse. And that God intervened through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, creating the present age, in which God is giving time for salvation, for us to come to knowledge and all that kind of stuff, and giving glimpse of what the future age will be. That at some point, the return of Jesus, the parousia of Jesus's return, coming along and introducing the final age, which will be when God's salvation, God's righteousness and justice will be full, will be complete. That now we're living in this present age where it's beginning. It has begun. God's intervention into it has begun, but it is not yet complete. And it will become complete, and the God will reign after Jesus' return. Okay. So I don't know about you, but that was a lot to talk about, and I'm sure that was a lot to hear. If you're confused about any of it, that's okay. That's okay. Feel free to call. Feel free to let me know. And if you want me to go over any of that a little bit more, like just one-on-one, even, I'll be happy to do that. But these are some of the things that I just felt this is very important to talk about right up front, so we have an idea, so we have some idea of what's going to happen before we get to it. Otherwise, I'd have to stop a lot in order to introduce each of these ideas as we went along. So we talked about it now. I'm still going to be, I'm sure, stopping a lot and talking about this stuff again, coming back to it, because it's kind of what it's all about, right? Well, friends, hope I didn't bore you to death. I know I'm risking things talking about this kind of stuff this early in the morning might put you back to sleep. But thank you. Thank you for spending your time with me. Look forward to this journey through Romans with you. It's going to be good. It'll be good. It'll be good. Oh, I should have said Romans has been a very influential book to many people throughout the centuries. It has been transformative. Martin Luther struggled with Romans, in particular with his understanding of that idea of God's righteousness. He was looking at it from a slightly different way, and he struggled with it until he changed his understanding of it and what it meant, and then it freed him completely. And he went on to write a commentary, his reflections on the book of Romans. I forget what it was called. And it was during the reading of Martin Luther's explanatory, his notes on Romans at a meeting of the Moravians, that John Wesley had his Aldersgate experience and felt his heart strangely warmed. It was during the reading of Luther's notes on Romans that Wesley had this transformational experience. It was also Romans that Karl Barth wrote a early first century, not first century, a 20th century, an early 20th century post. He wrote this post World War I, because prior to that point he was under a more traditional understanding of some things, but following World War I, he was all he saw things happen that shouldn't have happened and all that kind of stuff, and he wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Epistle of the Romans, right? The Epistle to the Romans was what he called it, and he literally flipped the theological world on its head with his understanding. It transformed 20th century theology substantially, and it still echoes. His writing echoes through our current understanding of much of theology. Anyway, okay, so it's an important book. Well, friends, that's going to be it for today. I appreciate your time. Thank you for spending some time with me today, and look forward to going through this again with you tomorrow and in the future. As you go about your days, of course, keep your eyes and ears open for everything that a very loving, caring, living, and active God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. When you see it, say, "Thanks, Papa," and then tell somebody about it, including me, especially me. I want to hear. Until tomorrow, be blessed, my friends. Be blessed.